Velkommen til Rig på Viden, en podcast om forskning i investering, finans og økonomi. Mit navn er André Thormann.
Vi har lavet den her episode i samarbejde med forskningscentret Percent inden fra Copenhagen Business School. De laver sammen med de danske pensionskasser en hel masse spændende forskning om pension, investering og økonomi. Og Percent de har et mål om at skabe interesse og viden på det her område ved at forske, undervise og formidle til fordel for alle de danske pensioner. Og det er jo også præcis det, som Rig på Viden står for. Så vi er vildt glade for det her samarbejde. Tag og skriv CBS og Percent på Google, for så kan du finde al deres forskning, og du kan tilmelde dig deres events.
In this episode of Rig på Viden will we explore strategies for optimizing pension plans, particularly those based on mandatory defined contributions. Joining us to shed light on this topic is Associate Professor Kathrin Schlafmann from CBS. Thank you so much for joining, Kathrin, and taking the time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Can you maybe just start by introducing yourself and what you do?
Of course. I'm an associate professor at Copenhagen Business School here in Copenhagen in the finance department. And I'm also a fellow of the Danish Finance Institute and a member of Percent. So that's the pension research center here at CBS. And my research, so I focus on household finance. So in my day-to-day, I spend my time thinking about how people buy houses, how do they finance the purchase of houses, and how do they save for pensions. So yeah, that's what I spend my time on. And from the personal perspective, before coming to CBS, I used to be a researcher in Sweden. I'm an assistant professor there. So even though I'm originally from Germany, I've spent now a good number of years in the Nordic countries. Yeah.
And today we are going to talk about pensions that you already mentioned. Why is this topic so interesting? Because it can come out somewhat boring sometimes.
Yeah, it might feel that way. But so I've always been interested in how people make financial decisions. So that's why I ended up doing research in household finance. And what that means is that I think about households or people as the normal people. So not the very rich, how they make their financial decisions, but how do just normal people make their financial decisions. And for that, well, there are two big decisions that you need to make, and one is how to finance. If you want to buy a house, how do you finance that? And the second one is how do you save for pensions? So how do you make sure that you have enough to live on during retirement? So even though it might sound a bit boring maybe, it's actually really important. So that's why we're trying to do the thinking also for people a bit to take the pressure off, and so that you can make sure you have enough savings for retirement. Yeah, so that's how I got interested in that.
Yeah, and before we talk about your specific paper, then what do we already know from the literature then about how people actually save for pension?
So we know quite a bit, but a lot of the research is actually coming from the US. As with many economics or finance research, a lot of it is done in the US, in the United States, and they have a very different pension system to what we have here. So there, most of the pension savings are in fact voluntary. So you can decide yourself how much you want to save for retirement or in which pension plans you want to participate. So there the focus is a lot on how to get people to participate in pension savings and to make sure that they don't leave money on the table with incentives and so on. On the other hand, what we have here in, for example, Denmark or Sweden, that is a mandatory system. So it's a completely different set of questions because it's not about how to get people to participate. Well, they have to, it's mandatory. It's more how to structure those, like what to mandate to make it optimal so that the system works for people. And there we know much less.
But do we know something?
Yes. So it's kind of a bit related to a lot of the questions are typically about how much should people be saving. So it's kind of the main goal of how much money should people have. And there's also a bit of a debate. So it's not clear what is the exact optimal amount that you should have when you go into retirement. So what is too much and what is too little. But so there is simply a debate, and we don't know really yet what that number is. Based on our own research, so what I've done with my co-authors, we actually looked for Sweden into how can we, if we look at the data for Sweden, and we want to understand how people save and how much do they actually accumulate in the system that they live in. So Sweden has, of course, a mandatory pension system. If we want to understand how do people react to that and what does it lead to, once we understood that, we wanted to compute, well, what if there was no pension system? What if they could completely freely decide what to do? We computed what would be the optimal amount to achieve, the optimal amount of savings that they would save up to. And what came out was actually that it was surprisingly similar in terms of the amount. Okay. So that's where it differed was how they actually achieved those savings. So that's what we ended up focusing on. But that was our take on what we do know about the level, which has been more of the focus so far.
Yeah, and we will get much more back to that. But just a last question regarding maybe the US compared to the mandatory system. Is it clear to see that people save up much more in the mandatory system than in the free system, so to speak?
I think there's much more heterogeneity in how much people save. So there are some people who simply fail to participate, and they then do not accumulate their savings. Also, the US has a system where you decide how much you want to put into your pension account, and then your employer will contribute an equal amount up to a limit. And we see there's research going on, just very current research that shows that systematically kind of lower social classes actually leave money on the table when it comes to that. So that such a system also disadvantages people who maybe are worse off to start with economically. And the mandatory pension system, because it's mandatory, everyone has to contribute. That is not a feature of that.
And I think that there has been a debate, especially in Denmark, about people over-saving essentially for pension. What do we know about that?
Well, as I said, there's a debate of whether we save too much. In the current system, our take was, if given all the system as it is now, so without extending the period for how long you work, and shortening the effective retirement period. So if we leave that out, just the system as it is now, from our analysis, it didn't seem that that was too much. But of course, if the system changes, we need to rethink. If one parameter changes, maybe others also need to adjust. So that's
Okay. And can we see that there is a big difference on the places where you have a mandatory system? That there is a big difference between how much people then save within the mandatory system?
Yes, I mean there. So there's in general there's a huge heterogeneity across countries. What is mandated? So
Okay.
that is certainly true. So there is a difference both whether it's mandatory or not. We've mentioned that, but then there's also the difference of how such a system is funded or how it's financed. So traditionally, when pension systems were introduced, they were typically so-called pay-as-you-go systems. Mm-hmm. That means that the people who currently are working, they essentially pay a tax, and that money is immediately used to pay the pensions of the current retirees. So that money is never actually stored anywhere. It's immediately just transferred from the working people to the current retirees. So that is a kind of an unfunded pay-as-you-go system. And then there are these funded systems where that's different, where the currently working people, they make their pension contributions, but that money actually goes in an account and that money is invested. And then when the same people retire, their pensions are paid from this account. So across different countries, the systems also differ wildly in how much of a share is funded and how much is pay-as-you-go. And then that also, of course, then depends on how high these savings are, also varies with that.
Mm. And maybe just one last question about the foundation of savings behavior and mandatory pension plans. And it's just a question regarding Why? So because there are so many OECD countries that favor this mandatory saving plans, and the question is basically why exactly that is, and whether the mandatory plan is necessarily a good thing.
Well, that is kind of a very fundamental question. It circumvents lots of problems, the ones I mentioned about that people don't save enough for retirement. That also goes hand in hand with if people don't save enough for retirement, then there will be some retirees who simply do not have enough money to live on. And I think similarly, the similar countries who have the higher mandatory systems are also the countries where you would then feel that you need to support the retirees who do not have enough funds. So then there would be redistribution ex post. And by having the mandatory system to start with, you also distribute when do people save, how much do they save of their own income. So I think it goes a bit hand in hand. For example, in the US, there is much less social security. So yes, then if there's no redistribution, if the retirees end up not having enough, then it's also for the society. If it's set up such that you don't help, then it's also less costly.
But is there any downsides to the mandatory system? Because now we sit in Europe, and especially in Northern Europe, and we favor this system, right? But it's not all over the world they use it, which must be of some reason, right? So is there any downside to having this mandatory plan?
So the downside is that you shift the responsibility to the policymaker to write down what is the mandate, and that is in many countries a one-size-fits-all solution. So that then means that it's also not exactly optimal for each individual person. Probably on average better than if many people don't save at all. But it does lack the kind of individualistic approach to the retirement savings or the financial system overall.
Yeah. All right. Let's go to your paper. We already spoke a bit about it, but now let's dive deep into it, because you wrote a paper called "Designing Pension Plans According to Consumption Savings Theory." Mm-hmm. So, what motivated you to dive into this?
Yeah. So, what this paper does is it takes a fully funded system, or they are also called the defined contribution pension plans, and that is a pension plan which is becoming more and more widespread in OECD countries. And we wanted to investigate, because it has not been studied as much, that we wanted to investigate what should this optimally look like. So before going into the details, maybe let me explain a bit what this plan actually is. So a defined contribution pension plan, it's a fully funded plan. That means you can think about it as if it's an account that has your name on it. So every month you are mandated, if it's a mandatory plan, to put a particular fraction of your income into this account. But then that money is yours. So it's in that account and it's invested. And your pensions will ultimately be paid out from this account when you go in retirement. So it's called defined contribution plan, because what's defined is the fraction that you need to contribute. So the contributions are defined. What is not defined, that is how much you will get out in the end, because that depends on all the returns that you earn on all those contributions that you make. So there's a bit of risk also involved later on, because you don't know exactly yet how much pension payments you will exactly get from your pension account. But this is the defined contribution plan, and this is becoming more and more widespread. So it's more and more countries are either introducing it or expanding it. And in many of these countries, this defined contribution is a fixed fraction of your income. So it's constant, it's completely unconditional. Everyone always has to put in a particular fraction. So this fraction might vary a lot across countries or across plans, but it does not vary across people or situations of the people. So it's if you are in a particular plan or in a particular country, then everyone participates the same fraction of income each month into that plan. And even though that is so common, that's almost all plans have this feature, there's actually no academic or economic justification for why this is the way it should be set up, that it's this fixed fraction of income. And that's what we wanted to set out to analyze. And so, because since it's so widespread, it's very important that we get this right, this mandate.
Yeah, so just to be completely sure, right? So in Denmark, for example, we have everyone contribute with something fixed from their wage, right?
Yes.
It can vary between the employer, how much they contribute, but everyone contribute. Actually, there are also some people that doesn't have it at all from their employer. I think consultants and so on, they don't have a mandatory pension, and then they just have to fund it themselves. But then there is the ATP. But is that an example of what you're saying?
Yes, exactly. So most people have these occupational pensions in Denmark through their employer, where they don't get a choice. They have to pay a certain fraction of their income. They don't see the money. They see it on their salary statement, but they don't actually get the money. It's immediately deducted and paid into the pension account. Yeah. That's exactly an example, right? Yes.
But even and that's what I'm thinking is a bit interesting. Even in Denmark, some employers decide not to do this, so it's not completely mandatory for them to require their employees to save up for pension.
Yeah, I mean that is a policy decision. Whether it's really mandatory for everybody. For me, it certainly is to contribute.
Yes.
So it's it also so there is heterogeneity in and that's also what our paper is about. Kind of how should people save and who should save when, which also depends on your income profile of a profession, kind of your occupation. So there are some occupation where this is more relevant than for others. So in that sense, it's a good thing that Denmark has the setup that it's on the pension plan level, so on your employer who you work with. That is a good thing because our results indicate that it's good to have this occupation specific these plans. Yeah.
Yeah, and but then, as you said, there is heterogeneity, right? Because it can vary a lot. If you're employed by the public sector, usually it will be much higher than if you're employed by the private sector, and if you're employed by the financial sector, usually it will be much higher than if it would be whatever else sector, right? So there is actually big variations between how much the mandatory is. Which I think is actually a bit surprising that it can vary so much, because that also affects, how much people save up for pension.
Yes, it does affect that. One thing to keep in mind, though, for these defined contribution plans is that even though you differ in how much you save, you're still saving for yourself. So it's your own account. So basically, what these plans do is they shift when do you get the resources to consume. Is it early on in your life or is it later in life? So the more you contribute, that doesn't mean the money is gone. It just means you get it later in life during your retirement. Yeah. So while it's still, unclear whether the huge discrepancy, like the huge heterogeneity, variety is justified, it's not that someone is paying higher taxes than someone else, because it's really you save for your own retirement.
Yeah. Yeah, I just think it's thinking about it a bit surprising that, if you're a policymaker, then you would just say, okay, let's not make this complex. We find an optimal savings percentage, right? And then it's whatever, 10% in pension contribution for everyone, right? Mm-hmm. But actually, if you look into a country like Denmark, there can actually be quite big variations. But that was just a thought I had, because, policymakers usually would make a simple thing, right? Which it actually isn't in Denmark either, right?
Yeah.
But coming back to your research, can you maybe talk about, because you look into Sweden in this paper, but what data do you look into? What method do you apply to dive into this?
Mm-hmm. So what we do is we look into what the, as I mentioned, kind of what these contribution rates should look like, whether they really should be this flat percentage. And what we find is that the flat percentage is in fact not optimal. So instead we find that we that these contribution rates should follow two principles. One is that they should increase with age, so younger people should contribute less than older people. And the second principle is that the contribution rates should adjust to the level of pension savings that you already have in your account relative to your current income. And we come to those conclusions kind of through a variety of methods. So we start out by writing down a fairly simple theoretical model of how it's optimal to save for retirement, and that we use to derive the principles to start with. And then we turn to, as you say, Swedish data. So we look into the administrative data from Sweden, and we look at, do people save that way in practice when we look at the data? And what we see is that many people, in fact, only save through the mandatory system. Sweden also has a very large mandatory system. So many people, almost half of the Swedes, they don't save anything in addition to that. And since that system has currently a flat contribution rate, they then by default do not follow these principles. So that motivated us to say, well, okay, so what if we were to reform those mandatory systems? How much better off would people be if we allowed this mandatory system to mimic the optimal rules? And that's what we then do with the last method, where we build a quantitative theoretical model, which is realistic, has many features of the actual Swedish pension system. So we built that, and then we simulate what would happen, how much better off would people be if the mandatory system would in fact follow those two rules, age dependent and dependent on the balance to income ratio. And we find that these welfare benefits are actually quite large, that you can get an increase of basically 2%, or an equivalent welfare increase of 2% increase in consumption every period, every month. So that is a substantial welfare improvement just by saving. When do people save, or in which situation do people save, not how much they save overall. So that we kind of kept constant.
Yeah, and to understand that, I guess it's important to understand this consumption savings theory, right? To get those two things together. So what is that exactly?
Yeah, so what we mean with consumption savings theory is basically the theory of, if you look at the life cycle profile of people's income and consumption and saving, then we want to know in which situations should people save more out of their income, and in which situations should they consume more. Taking into account that they also face risks. So in the context of pension savings, that's mostly income risk and the risk that's coming from the investment returns. Let me maybe be a bit more specific. So what that particularly interesting or important when we think about when should people save are two features of the life cycle income and consumption. One is age. So typically younger people have lower income currently than what they will have once their careers develop and they earn more as they get a bit further in their working life. So from how much they will earn throughout their lifetime, that means currently they actually only earn a smaller fraction of that. But they would like to already consume something of it, so it would be optimal for them to borrow against their future income, which in practice is very hard. So they are essentially constrained. And at the same time, this is often also the period where you want to start a family, you want to save up for a down payment to purchase a home. So this is on top of that, even a period where you have high expenses. So to force people to also make high pension contributions in that phase of their life is actually very costly. So that motivates having kind of postponing somewhat, so to have lower contribution rates early in life than later in life, in working life. And then the second principle that relates to career, like you can think about career trajectories. So just take a person, imagine that person has had a very good high-paying job for a good number of years. So they've also contributed quite a bit to their pension account already throughout those years. But this money, since it's a pension account, is only available once they go into retirement. So they can't spend that money right now. It's waiting for them when they enter retirement. If that person now loses their job or changes job to a lower paying position, that means that they have all this money waiting for them when they go into retirement, but right now they actually have low income. So then it would be optimal for them not to contribute much in addition to what they've already have waiting for them and consume more of the current income. And the reverse is also true. So if you get later in your working life a bump in your income, you get a very good job. Well, if you then want to keep the living standard that you can now afford, if you want to keep that throughout retirement, then you need to contribute more so that you build up higher savings. So this motivates why the contribution rates should adjust to the pension balance of how much you've already accumulated relative to your current income.
Mm. And because that is super interesting, right? And essentially some of it I think is also quite logical, right? That it makes sense to save less when you're very young because you need to spend money on other things, right? Have we seen any countries actually taking actions on stuff like this? So saying, okay, maybe we should make it a bit more flexible, so people save less when they're young, for example, or maybe are able to use some of the pension savings while they are young, because, for example, in Denmark, if you want to use some of the same pension savings while you're young, then you will pay 60% in tax or something like that, right? A huge tax fine, essentially from using it early on, right? So have we seen any countries actually using this?
So there are it's very, very rare that you would have age-dependent rules. What is sometimes there is kind of in certain life situations that you have less of a tax rate if you want to take it out early. Oh. So, for example, I don't know if you divorce or if you have sometimes you can take money for a down payment, to take money out for a down payment. But again, then there it's the danger of if you make it that specific to tie it to the down payment, then behavior comes in if people then tend to buy homes that they wouldn't buy otherwise. So it's a bit the voluntary part then comes already in if it's discretionary, if people want to change. So if we want to keep this mandatory system, our way of freeing up the savings and also making sure that people later on actually make up for what they did not save initially is to make this more age dependent and automatically adjust to basically let people to save up to a optimal ratio of what their pension savings should be relative to what their income is.
Yeah, but have you also looked into that part, so whether people could pre-use some of the pension while they were young?
So if we were to follow our rule, this is basically built in because they don't have to first build up the pensions to then take them out. Yeah. So they would have the resources while they are young, available to spend as they think is best. Yeah. But they already know as well that when they get older, they will need to pay higher contributions. So that would be they should take that into account when they think about, for example, which house to buy or
All right, and then let's just try to build the link, because you already said it and it was some pretty interesting numbers, I think you said. So how exactly does this affect consumption, and can we try to build that link, because you said something like 2% increase in whatever consumption?
Yeah, so of course so that goes a bit into who has the more resources, and that is predominantly the people who either are younger because they contribute less while they are young, so they have more resources available, so they have higher consumption, and then also people who, as in my example earlier, when your income drops, they will then also have higher consumption compared to the system where they have to keep contributing regardless of how what their balance looks like. So if we want to boil that down to one number, that was kind of on average how much better off you are if you had this system as opposed to the constant fraction of system. That would be the equivalent of increasing your consumption that you have in each period. You have 2% higher consumption on average. But of course, that means that the young have even more and higher increase, and then the people who save. But there are periods where you have to save more because you need to make up for the savings.
Yeah, but doesn't it all add up to zero? Because I guess people will spend more early on in their life, but less later on in their life.
Oh yes, I see. So what the welfare benefits basically tell us that by shifting, so we are not changing how much resources people have. People have their life cycle income, the life cycle earnings. What we're shifting is in which situation can they consume, and in which situations do they need to save. And we shift like these rules. If we follow the optimal system, then they get to consume in the periods where it's the most useful for them, where they're the most constrained. So they get the highest benefit of having more resources. And that translates into, it would be a similar gain to just give everyone 2% more consumption. But that is just to kind of get a feeling for how much utility that is. And we always, like in economics, we write it down in what's your utility, but that is a number you can't really grasp.
Yeah.
So it would be a similar increase, how much better off you are, as if you would simply give people 2% more consumption each period.
Yeah.
Even though, of course, the resources don't change, which is shifting when do people consume.
And about the resources, because I would actually think that the resources do change. Because if you are saving up, then you are postponing some consumption today for a higher consumption later on because you generate some kind of interest. So wouldn't the resources actually be smaller if people consumed more early on?
So that goes back to kind of, you have the compound returns. So typically the advice is you should start saving early because then you get compound returns and you get higher kind of bang for your buck in savings.
Exactly.
So that is built in. So that is true that you don't get these in when we model this, you don't get these compound returns on early contributions if you don't make those contributions or lower contributions. But this is overcompensated by, it's very useful for you to actually have this higher consumption early in life. So that is more important essentially. What we did hold constant is that we didn't change how many savings people have when they enter retirement. So we wanted to make sure that on average, people have the same replacement rates or the same pension payments relative to their working life income as before. So that was a constraint that we put on because we didn't want to change the resources, how much they have available during retirement. We only wanted to look at how do you optimally achieve those pension payments.
Yeah. And but when you're saying when you're saying it's compensated, then you're talking about utility essentially, right?
Yes.
But the resources in crowns, that must change, right?
Well, so if you save less early in life, that also means you need to save more later in life. So it's
okay.
So it's not we're just relieving young people from saving, and then it's the same constant fraction as what we're currently doing. Instead, it's going to be higher later in life. You just know it also already that is going to be the case, because as you say, if you don't save, then if you don't adjust your savings later, then you would have less resources. So we shift the profile, less early in life and more later in working life.
Yeah, but then it must, because then they don't get the compounded interest, right, from early on in life, and then they, essentially they must save up more in absolute terms later in life. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yes, but that is the period where they're then no longer constrained because they're at their peak of their working life, so they don't want to borrow against their future income anymore because they know it's gonna typically go down. From now on, so they're saving in any case, so it's less costly for them to save. So they need to save more, but in that phase of life, it's less costly.
And Another question I want to ask is that often I see government as kind of paternalistic, that they want to control how much people do, right? Essentially because they don't know what people will spend their money on. So how are we sure that people will actually spend their money on, houses or apartments or the things we want them to spend their money on, and not whatever cars or any type of luxury that doesn't accumulate some kind of return?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, it's the question of how much freedom we want to give people to spend their money. And yes, we want to make sure that they have enough for retirement. That's what the retirement system is there for, or this mandatory system. And even though we change when they save, we do not change how much they save. So it's still a mandatory system. But outside of that, we think that people should be free to decide what they feel is the most important thing to spend their money on.
Yeah.
So of course there's still going to be differences what people think is the most important for them, but maybe that's also a good thing that there is that freedom to just spend the money on things that are important to you and not what the policymaker thinks is the most.
But then you could argue for not having a mandatory plan at all, right?
Yes, but then we're kind of back into the US system, and that's why we have these different systems and the different kind of philosophies of how we approach the whole state, the whole social security. And I think in Denmark we have big social security, but still we have freedom to spend on what we want to spend money on. So it's a bit of a mix, but certainly we're further in the mandatory system than, for example, in the US, where it's a lot about freedom of choice, or much more so than here.
And then just a follow up on that, because essentially we are talking about changing a winning formula, I would say, because these systems, I know we want to put in more flexibility into the system, but essentially it's a system that has been working very, very well, especially for the Nordic countries. So why change a winning formula?
Well, I mean, you're right that we have a very nice pension system. In international comparison, Denmark has one of the best pension systems, but that doesn't mean that there are not smaller things that we can tweak. We don't want to fundamentally change the system. So, for example, in our analysis, we don't think that we should change the amount that people save. We shouldn't change that it's a mandatory system overall. But having these kind of fundamental principles, we see that we get huge increases in welfare, so how much people, how well off they are, without changing how much basically the pension system, how big that pension system is. So this is we see it as a smaller change, but one that has actually large welfare improvements for people.
All right. Let's just sum up the conclusions that you made in your paper.
Yeah. So we find that if you follow those two principles, so if you let contribution rates into these mandatory defined contribution plans be age dependent, and you allow for people to have different contribution rates depending on their balance to income payments, then without changing how much people save, you can actually get large improvements. And that means that basically everyone is better off ex ante. And it also means that you get less differences in the replacement rates, what you see when people actually go into retirement. And that comes mainly from the fact that everyone is saving to this target ratio of this balance to income. And since the pension balance directly translates into the pension payments, that also means that everyone saves up to a similar ratio of pension payments to their pre-retirement income, so they have similar replacement rates. So we would get less dispersion, less differences, less inequality in those replacement rates in that system.
All right. Is there anything we haven't covered yet?
No, I think... So one thing which is nice about these household finance topics is that very often it's hard to analyze the data, and it's even more challenging if you want to develop optimal systems. So that is fairly challenging, but at the end of the day, what comes out, the ultimate message, is often fairly straightforward. And I think we got that, we talked about that message. So I think this paper is one of those where we can summarize it fairly easily in what the takeaway is. Yeah. So I think we covered that.
Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Tak for, at du lyttede med til Rig på Viden. Jeg håber, at du lærte noget, og hvis du nu synes godt om vores podcast, så kan du støtte os ved at følge den på Spotify eller skrive en anbefaling på iTunes. Inde på LinkedIn, der kan du følge André Thormand, Benjamin Somofen eller Henrik Fode Rasmussen. På genhør.